Good morning. I don't know who that was Mark was talking to about, but I don't know who that guy is at all. Good morning, everybody. I am so glad to be here with you guys. We're going to talk about a subject that's true and dear to my heart, and that subject is true servant leadership. And I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. I need to get the screen shared, or somebody can share. Let me share the screen. I got some slides. All right, thank you so much. And now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to put this in slideshow mode. So the title of my presentation this morning is true servant leadership. And I use the term true because it's very important, where some people can think of leadership, but it's not really true leadership. And so we're going to talk about true servant leadership today. And as my subtitle, it says servant leaders are a revolutionary bunch. They take the traditional power leadership model and turn it completely upside down, which is what a lot of you do here in the Rotary Club of All Nations. So when I think of the term servant leadership, I think of three major qualities, right? Putting others' needs before their own, devoted to or guided by something larger than themselves, and a person who guides, conducts, or inspires people to move to action. And to me, in my lifetime, one of the greatest examples of that is Nelson Mandela, who's there in the picture there at the bottom right of the slides. Nelson Mandela was South Africa's first Black head of state and was the first elected in a fully representative democratic election in South Africa. He stood up for what he believed in, and he served 27 years in prison. He was instrumental in dismantling apartheid in South Africa because he believed in freedom, not just for Black people, not just for white people, but for all human beings. And so he has been one of the greatest inspirations to me and one of the greatest examples of what true leadership is. So how does one become an effective servant leader? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of tips. The first one is you serve out of love. If you're not passionate about why you're serving, you just won't be effective at what it is that you're doing. Serve others' needs before your own, putting others' needs ahead of yourself, like what we did in the Rotary Club, the Rotary Club of All Nations, when we hosted that vaccine clinic. We all risked our lives out there on that great project. Thinks of others and cares for them, and then realizes the values of your fellow human being. We all deserve human respect, and we all deserve human dignity. And when you have these qualities, you can be an effective servant leader. So let's break this down a little bit more so you can see what true servant leadership is. Because if it's anything I want you guys to leave with today, it's being able to identify what true servant leadership is. So a self-serving leadership style, the objective is to be served. A servant leadership style, the objective is to serve. Self-serving leadership style seeks first to be understood, then understand. The servant leadership style seeks first to understand, then to be understood. The self-serving leader sees and treats others as inferior. The servant leader sees and treats others with respect. The self-serving leader rejects input. The servant leader encourages input. The self-serving leader takes the credit. The servant leader shares the credit. My team's always talking about, Gerald, you always say we. Even though I went to DC, we went to DC. Using expediency as a main criteria for action, the self-serving leader. The servant leader uses moral principles as a main criteria for action. The self-serving leader is accountable only to the superiors. The servant leader is accountable to others and the subordinates. And the self-serving leader clings to power and position, while the servant leader will develop others to be more capable. In other words, empowering people to be a leader. So this is a great chart. If you ever want to do a self-evaluation of yourself, or you want to take a look at others, this is a great chart to be able to measure where your leadership style stands. And if you think that you need to make some improvements in either one of these areas, hopefully this will be a guide for you. So what does a self-serving leadership team looks like? This is the best team I have ever had to serve on with. I thought when I first joined this team that all of these people were crazy. I have never seen a group of people who would sacrifice so much of their time and their energy. They'd be the first ones into the office and last people out of the office. This is the team that I served with at the Air Intelligence Agency in the Air Force. In the middle, there's a 2-star general, Major Paul LeBras. And then to his left is my boss, Mrs. D. Studevant. Miss Studevant, we called her Miss D. Before heads of state, senior leaders of the government, senior leaders of the military would go see the general, they go see Miss D first. And she was a great mentor to so many people all across the country as well in the world. And these were my teammates. All of them exhibited the qualities of servant leadership. And I learned so much from each and every single one of them. Jim Wyatt, still one of my top mentors to this day. I had that chance to serve as a senior advisor to the Texas Association of African American Chambers of Commerce. And I love this moment. I think a reporter captured this moment where Jim was teaching me at the Texas State Capitol in this moment. And Jim is a classic example of someone who helped many African American businesses get access to like $1.6 billion in the state of Texas. Even though he wasn't getting access to that 1.6 billion, he made sure that other people did. And I truly appreciated the leadership that Jim showed, and he still shows me today as one of my mentors. One of the greatest service projects I ever had a chance to be a part of. I worked at St. Peter, St. Joseph Children's Home when I retired from the Air Force. And about 500 employees from USAA came over and helped us create something called Inspirational Park on the south side of San Antonio, Texas. And we built a bike barn, we built the outdoor basketball court, we built golf, putting greens, a huge soccer field, picnic area, and then we lined the soccer field with billboards of inspirational messages and quotes in English and Spanish. It was one of the greatest projects that I've ever worked on with a group of people together. True servant leadership. Some of you may recognize some of these faces today. That's some of these kids who all of these young men are survivors of the shooting at Parkland. Just recently, right? We just passed in our country for the first time in 26 years, law that regulated guns in the United States because of the voices of young people like these folks from March for Our Lives who've experienced a mass shooting, and then they got activated and they sacrificed and did so much work all across the country, put in more than 1 million steps at the US Capitol. And now we have our first gun law legislation in over 26 years. Another great example of outstanding servant leadership. And this person here, who I'm shaking hands with, this is Mr. Ed Jolly. He won't be remembered, by most Americans or anybody in the world. But Mr. Ed Jolly gave the United States 60 years of his life, 30 years in uniform and 30 years as a civilian. Mr. Jolly, whenever the National Security Agency director, whenever the CIA director, whenever the Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States himself needed to have the most secure telephone conversation, that man right there, Mr. Ed Jolly, made it happen. Mr. Jolly was such a servant leader that he would be the first person out of 18,000 people to show up at the agency, and he would be the last one to leave. Mr. Jolly was at work so much that he had this rusted, beat up car, right? And the security forces thought that it had been abandoned in the parking lot. And they towed Mr. Jolly's car because the car was there all the time. And when we finally got Mr. Jolly's car back, they couldn't believe that actually it was somebody who was driving that car who was coming to work every single day. And it was actually Mr. Jolly. He was one of the greatest examples of servant leadership that I have ever seen. He used an electronic device that the Russians, as well as, I take that back, the Germans and the Japanese during World War II, neither one of them ever were able to break that communication, and neither of them were able to capture that particular device. Mr. Jolly was the man who made that happen. And even though he experienced racial discrimination when he was coming up in the Air Force, he didn't let that stop him, and he went on to get promoted to the highest rank as he enlisted as a Chief Master Sergeant. And then he went on as a civilian to make it up to GS-14, which was the highest as GS-15, but he made it to GS-14 before he retired at 60 years. And I had the honor and I had the distinct privilege of orchestrating his retirement ceremony. When he called me and told me he wanted me to do that, that was that was like the greatest honor ever. So saying all that to say this, that I've given you some examples of what servant leadership looked like. My friend Ed Jolly, the folks from March for Our Lives, who helped change America's gun laws for the first time in 27 years. USAA, one of the largest companies in the United States, took time out of their day with 500 employees to create a park on the south side of San Antonio. Jim Wyatt, making sure that African Americans got access to the $1.6 billion in the state of Texas. As a matter of fact, during this time, the African Americans were only getting access to 1.2%. I take that back. That was the category minorities was only getting 1.2% of the contracts in the state of Texas. And Jim helped orchestrate it to where African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans all got access to the Texas economy. And finally, the greatest example of a team that I've ever been on that demonstrated a love for the job to the point that I thought they were all crazy when I came to work and they all had their house shoes at their desks. That's how dedicated that they were to the job. And finally, bam, this chart. This is the most important part of my presentation that I wanted to share with you guys today. It is this chart so that you can identify where you are as well as others and help mentor and encourage people to be servant leaders and not a self-serving leader. That concludes my presentation. And if you got any questions, I am here.